Morning. Okay. So we started the Imrei Yaakov yesterday on this long seif that when you lend someone money with witnesses, then you should not write up paper unless the debtor gives permission. Okay, so we were in the middle of this piece. We were talking. He said, let's start from over here. He says, "V'hinei ha dekaimelan demilva b'shtar gova min hamishubadim." We paskin that when you lend money with a promissory note, you can collect from encumbered property that has a lien on it, that's already, let's say, been sold to somebody else. So he says, "Nechlaku bo harishonim." There's a machlokus in the Rishonim. V'yesh omrim hatam deshibuda deoraisa. So he says, so that's the first opinion that we saw yesterday. One approach to this whole idea is that the Torah always places a lien on all of the property of the debtor, and then the Chachamim took off some of that lien for the sake of buyers, okay? Because there are certain kinds of situations where the buyer is simply not going to know when he purchases a property that there's a lien on it. And what situations are those? So that's what we saw yesterday. When a loan is made with paper, so then we say that it has what's called a kala. It has a call. It has a voice. People are more likely to know about that. And when they try to do discovery, they'll be able to discover that the person selling the property is in debt, and therefore they'll think twice before purchasing real estate from this individual. So but by contrast, if a person makes creates an oral debt where there's no paper trail, so this is much harder to discover. And as a result, the rabbis removed the lien that's on any property of a debtor that makes only an oral debt, in order to not cause unsuspecting buyers to lose out. Right, so that's the point. You had to.
How are you going to know? Is there a red land registry? Was there
right? So there was no land registry back then. It was based on doing your due diligence and speaking to the neighbors. Hey, do you know this guy Yankel? Sure, Yankel. Yeah. And if I noticed that some guys were at his house the other day, and in other words, there's a greater likelihood that when and also they hired the sofer, and the sofer came over. So there's going to be, it's more of a spectacle when paper is drawn up, because it was a whole production. You had to hire a sofer, and it was something that was unusual, that would raise the attention of the neighbors when you would draw up a debt with paper. It's not like we do today. You just print it out on your HP printer, right? It was a whole production.
Nobody talks to the neighbors.
Yeah, and it was a whole production to hire a sofer back then. So therefore, if a loan is made with paper, so then there's a much greater likelihood that people will know about this. And so when someone wants to buy property from the debtor, he will be able to ascertain that this property may be encumbered, okay? But when it's an oral loan that's made without any paper, so then we're much more concerned that this could be hidden. And therefore the rabbis removed the biblical lien that would normally be on it as an accommodation to unsuspecting buyers. So that's approach number one. Okay, that's approach number one. Approach number two, v'yesh omrim deshibuda lav deoraisa. The other approach is that no, the Torah does not place an automatic lien on a debtor's property. Ela de b'milva b'shtar avad rabbanan takanta shalotinol deles bifnei lovin. But when it comes to written debts, when it comes to debts that utilize paper, the rabbis made an accommodation not for the buyer but for the borrower. Meaning what? Meaning that if a person is not going to have a lien on a person's property when he lends money, no one's going to lend money. If I can't secure my debt on property of yours, then how do I know that you're ever going to pay me back? And that being the case, if there's no security on a loan, lenders are not going to lend money. Well, that's the point, is that if a person owns real estate, that's the most solid security that you have, because chattel, can always disappear.
Yeah.
Real estate doesn't disappear. And so that's the reason why the rabbi, it's not a biblical mechanism, but it's a rabbinic accommodation to ensure that people will continue lending money. But they only created that lien on debts with paper. But with debts without paper, if the lender is so carefree that he doesn't mind lending money without paper, so then we're not going to place a lien on the debtor's property. So those are the two approaches. Essentially, it boils down to the same halacha. It's just a question of what's the origin of a lien that lands up on a person's property when he goes into debt to somebody else. Okay, so the hashach, let me just go to the next page. The hashach herich bazeh, umasik dehachriya bazeh. He says, the Shach says, he goes into great length in trying to determine which one is it. Is it the former or is it the latter? And Vahavi Sveika Dedina Ayin Sham. And it ends up that we're not sure which one it is. Now, it sounds like from the language that the Shach feels that there would be some practical difference in halacha, whether this is a biblical mechanism or a rabbinic mechanism. It could be that in cases where there's a suffix, question is it suffix d'oraisa l'chumra, suffix d'rabanan l'kula? So maybe that's the issue. I don't know. Okay, but he's just really, Rav Stern is just giving us the highlights of this discussion. But apparently, if we were to look in the Shach, it would be a much longer discussion. Vida od de milva b'shtar hainu davka keshechasmu ha'edam atzmam al etzem ha'inyan. He says, and here's another thing it's important to know, that when we say that a debt was generated with a shtar, with a promissory note, that's only when the witnesses sign to have witnessed the transaction. Aval im chasmu rak lakayim chasimas ba'al hashtar, ein lo din shtar chov sheyigba bo mimishubadim uchidolakamen sif yudches ayin sham. But if the witnesses just confirm that we can testify that this is the signature of the lender or the signature of the debtor, so then that's not called a legitimate promissory note, and therefore that would not entitle the creditor to collect from encumbered property, because they're not actually signing on the actual transaction. They're just signing to confirm that we recognize that these signatures are authentic. Okay? Furthermore, that's only when the contract did not change hands in front of witnesses. Ani ploni chayv lechamanu masar hashtar bifnei edim avale shtar gomer v'govim imishavli. So it goes the other side as well. Let's say there's a piece of paper that has the signature of the creditor and the signature of the debtor, or it just has the signature of the debtor, and it basically says on such and such a date, Shimon borrowed money from Ruvain. I borrowed $1,000 from Ruvain. And witnesses witness the transfer of that note from Shimon to Ruvain. Even if they do not sign on that shtar, that is still considered to be a legitimate promissory note because there are witnesses that witness the transaction. You just would have to summon them in Beis Din. If the debtor challenges the authenticity of the document, you'd have to summon them, the witnesses, to Beis Din to testify. And the reason is Dekiven de Eda Mesira Karti, the Edi Mesira Mafki Lakala, Dino Kishtar Gomer Begova Filo Mimishabdi. And the reason is this is a sugya from Maseches Gittin, which is who consummates, like which witnesses consummate the transaction. And so we end up paskening that it's Ede Mesira Karti. It is the witnesses who see the exchange of the document from one hand to another. They're the ones that are pivotal. So as long as you have witnesses that can testify that they saw the transaction of the passage of the note from the debtor to the creditor, then that's what creates the coal. That's what creates the this idea that people will discover it because the witnesses are present. It creates like a spectacle when you have witnesses present at the time of a transaction, and so that's sufficient. Their signatures do not have to be on the shtar itself. Well, no, they have to read it. They have to read it. They have to know what's on it. And by the way, like we learned before, it's not just enough for them to see an exchange of cash. They have to, the lova, the debtor, has to basically say, here's the promissory note for the money that you lent me. They don't even have to necessarily see an exchange of cash. They could see the exchange of cash, or even if they don't see the exchange of cash, all they have to see is the debtor giving the creditor a promissory note, and which says that I owe you X number of dollars. The guy,
just seems like they actually signed on the document.
yeah, but obviously, and if we videotaped it, it would be even better, right? And if they registered it with the bank, it would be even better. We're saying the halacha that we're learning. What is the mechanism? What is the necessary mechanism? V'gam im lo hayachayev lo mikavar ela shemischayev atalo adin kain. And this is true if there was never a debt. Im lo hayachayev lo mikavar ela shemischayev lo shemischayev alo. That if there had never been any previous debt or connection between the debtor and the creditor, and it's only being generated now, as long as the witnesses see the transfer of paper, that's sufficient. But that's only according to the Shulchan Aruch, who holds that with contracts, all the witnesses need to see is the transfer from the debtor to the creditor. They don't have to be signatories. But this too is a machlokas. So we're getting a lot more than we bargained for. We're seeing a lot of machlokas here. B'yesh desvira lahu de bishtaros lo mahani ede misur lechud ela ba'inan ede chasima. There are certain rishonim who hold that it's not enough just to have witnesses witness the transfer of paper from debtor to creditor, but they also have to be signatories on the paper. The hashach asmo machzik de muchzak yachol omar kimli, and the shach says that if a person wishes to refuse to pay, he could say, "Well, I paskin like those rishonim, who hold that if there's no signatures on the document, then it's not legally binding to be able to collect from encumbered property." I know.
Okay. No, because it just seems like
what we're discussing is what is the minimal mechanism that you need in order to create a binding obligation that can be enforced in court. This is what this whole exercise
I
is.
understand. I'm just saying it goes so far as to have to force the person to see the document was transferred, but append your signature. It's not like just seeing two people walk down the street.
You're assuming that the witnesses are A, literate, and B, have ink and a pen. That's a lot. That's a lot to assume. Okay. Now, Kaimalan, the Yachol Adam Lachayev Atzmo Bishtar, Gamim Lo Hayachayev Lo Klal. We also paskin that a person may generate a debt for himself even if he never borrowed money. In other words, and we talked a little bit about this before. Let's say I have a reason. Let's say I want to do business with you. And there are some big corporations or like very, very wealthy balabatim that will tell you, you want to do business with me? So you know how much of a privilege it is to do business with me? You know how wealthy I can make you? What are you willing to give me? What are you willing to give me to become a preferred vendor? Right? And sometimes it's to the benefit of the other party to gift something to that other person as a way of getting into the doorway. So let's say a guy says, I want to do business with this wealthy man. But I don't have anything to give him right now, but I give him a document that says, I am hereby indebting myself to you X amount of dollars or X amount of pieces of merchandise, just as a sign of goodwill, in the hopes that we'll do business sometime in the future, right? So, which companies?
IT companies.
IT companies do it with banks. Okay, so we paskin that the debtor can generate a shtar even when there was no loan that was ever made. He just wants to indebt himself for whatever reason. A person can indebt himself with a shtar to a creditor.
Is that why we just making a pledge to tzedakah?
Right. Right.
An ulterior motive there.
Right. Well, it doesn't matter what your motive is. The point we're trying to make is that a person has the ability to generate debt where even when there was no exchange of anything. You can generate a debt out of nothing, just out of ex nihilo. Right. No, it's not conditional.
So you get yourself for a certain amount with no conditions. In other words, basically owe the person money no matter what transpires in terms of the business.
Correct.
The transaction.
Right. And sometimes you take your chances. Right. Right. No, it's not a commission agreement. If I understand what the word commission means, the point is that any person can generate a debt out of nothing, out of thin air. A person could have any number of motives. Let's say I marry your daughter, right? And I want to show you that I'll be a generous son-in-law. Yeah, there could be any reason, but you can call it whatever you want. It's not an untoward thing to do necessarily. There's nothing unethical about it. Yeah, yeah. What if? Yeah.
Don't get anything. We just I'm going to give $1,000.
Document for this. It's not a pledge.
You could do it in a document.
Yeah, you can generate a pledge as a legal document, because now when it comes to issues like pledges, remember there is consideration that a donor receives back. They get recognition. They get to be called up at the dinner. There may be matching funds that other people will give as a result of his gift. There's a lot of motivation that a person might have to generate a debt. So that's all he wants to say, right? Shekosev lo biksav yado ani ploni chayev lechamane. That a person can just write in a promissory note, I, Shimon, owe you, Ruvain, $100 or $1,000, umoser lo hashtar, and he can give him the promissory note. Okay, uvemesiras hashtar mischayiv lo me'ata hamane, and from the moment that the paper is transferred from the debtor to the creditor, that's when the debtor owes him the money. Im moser lo beino levein atzmo gova mibnei chorin, the imosra bifnei edim gova mimishabdi ladas hasovrim the edim esida akarti canal. If it is given without witnesses, so then that promissory note can only collect from unencumbered property. You can't, after the debtor has sold off his assets, you can't go to the purchasers and demand that they surrender that property because you have no lien because there were no witnesses. But if there were witnesses present and they saw the passage of the paper from one hand to the other, and you paskin ede mesira karsi, like we said before, that just witnesses who see the transaction is sufficient, so then the guy could collect even from encumbered property. The davka im kasav al kolpanim biksav yado o shechasam alav. But here too, there are limitations to the strength of a promissory note. It either has to be recognizably the handwriting of the debtor, where witnesses say, I recognize that Shimon wrote that paper, or Shimon has to sign it. So it could be printed by a sofer or by a printer, right? And then as long as he signs it on the bottom, and it's recognizably his signature, that is sufficient for him to, the creditor to be able to collect from the debtor. Avalim ish acher kasav al haniyar, v'hu lo chasam alav, af shemo de denasnu lo beino levein atzmo, eino klum. But if the document is written by a third party and the debtor doesn't sign it, even if he acknowledges that we did exchange this paper, it's not enforceable in Beis Din. Even if the debtor himself says, yeah, I gave him that piece of paper, it's absolutely halachically meaningless. De'ein kan Torah shtar klal rak niyar ba'alma masrlo litzachek bo. Because it has no strength of a shtar, and the debtor, Shimon, could claim, I was just kidding around. I was just kidding around. It's like monopoly money. It doesn't have any legal standing whatsoever. The bichdei shiel of Torah shtar ba'inan o chasam be'edim o kasuf b'ksav yada. In order for something to have the power of a shtar, it either has to be signed by witnesses or signed by the individual himself or written in his handwriting. That's necessary. O chasam b'chsimas yada. O masur b'fnei edim. Or let's say the debtor is illiterate, can't sign his name, can't write. At least it has to be given over to pass hands in the presence of witnesses. Once it's done in the presence of witnesses, a guy can't say I was playing games. Okay? Aval hamoser niyar beino levein atzmo shekasav bo sadi nusun lecha eino klum. But if a guy gives a fellow a piece of paper that says, my field is hereby yours, I hereby gift my field to you, I, Shimon, gift my field to Ruvain, doesn't have his signature, doesn't have witnesses on it, then it's completely meaningless. And therefore, it may not be very nice that the guy is giving him the Brooklyn Bridge or whatever he's promising him, and he may be deceptive, but it legally has no standing. No, if it's in his handwriting, that is legal.
So how far, I know we're into modern day before I get questioned about whether that's in business. If someone sends an email, just make a pledge. How would that be viewed? Because it's coming from his.
It's a very good question. I don't know what the legal halachic standing of an email commitment is. Well, this is true. We do. I mean, it could be only because of Dina de Malchusa that we do that. It could be that since the law of the land recognizes email as being legally binding, then because now, again, Now, the question is, what if a guy says, now you can fabricate an email, but is there a way to do forensics on an email to definitively trace it back to someone's computer?
Yeah.
There is. I just want.
If you gave access,
Know where it comes from.
if you gave access to someone else to your email account,
VPNs.
There are ways to mask your identity, but what if does an email have the what is it, the number, what's it called? The
URL.
not the URL, is it what, an IPN? What is it? The IP address? Does an email contain the IP address of the sender? No, but I'm saying without a VPN, does it contain the IP address of the sender? Uh-huh. Right. So if you went to Rogers, they could maybe, but you'd have to probably get a subpoena. Yeah. Anyway, so the moral of the story is, yeah.
That's a modern day.
Yeah, I saw, it's a very good question, Paul. I don't know the answer as far as from a halachic standpoint, but I guess if there was a way for you to trace it, that it came from the debtor's computer, that might be sufficient even from a halachic standpoint. But I don't know what Dina de Malchusa would say. Okay. All right. So that was an interesting exercise. Let's see. So now, so let's go back to our text. The text was that if Reuven lends Shimon money with witnesses, the witnesses still do not have the right to draw up paper without consent of the lova. Ki shema ein ritzono shalova shia lamal v'shtar chovalav. Because maybe the debtor does not want there to be paper. He may not want to encumber his property. And he's entitled to say, I'm only willing to borrow money from you if we do this as an oral loan and not as a written loan. Of course, the lender has a right to say, well, then I ain't lending you the money. But you can't, just because they called witnesses to make this a legally binding debt, does not mean that the creditor is entitled to have paper drawn up if that was not without the consent of the debtor. He can't, after the fact, say, I demand to have a promissory note drawn up. The guy can say, no, with all due respect, I owe you the money. The witnesses will testify, but I'm not drawing up paper because paper will encumber my property. Now, as a matter of course, the Gemara says that you should never lend someone money without witnesses and without paper. You should never do it. Why? Because it's almost like an avera of lifnei iver lo sitein michshol. You're placing a stumbling block in front of a blind man. You may cause the debtor to sin, because when he discovers that there's no evidence whatsoever that there's a debt, that he owes money, his Yetzer Hara may get the best of him. And the Gemara's attitude, therefore, is anyone who lends money without evidence, without a shtar, right, is like you're the bad guy, even though you're doing him a favor, right? But you're the bad guy. Shame on you for not verifying the loan. You're not obligated to in the paper because the lien is immediately attaches to every square inch of the guy's real estate, every holding. Yeah. So, and as a matter of fact, you see, that's a good point. Let's say a guy has several parcels of land. He sells off half of them. You can't go to the parcels of land that he's already sold first. You got to collect first from the unencumbered property to collect the debt. And it's only if the unencumbered is not collectible, then you go to the encumbered. Okay. So the next point that we said is shel love sheyihi lamal v'shtar chovalav b'medvarm kshlo kanu miyad or shel love. But when do we say that the witnesses cannot independently draw a paper? That's only when there was no kinyan made. But if there was a kinyan made, so then you can automatically assume that the lova has consented to draw a paper, and that's what we'll continue with Amir Tzashem tomorrow. Okay.